when I approached Ben Ferencz this year, and knowing that we are commemorating 25th anniversary of genocide in Srebrenica, and it coincided with 100th birthday of Ben's, which was in March, I simply couldn't resist the idea and asked him, Ben, could you go to the YouTube recordings when you as a young lawyer, 27-8, are using the word genocide in a courtroom while prosecuting former Nazi crimes without a genocide still being normatized as a crime in international criminal code. So it is, and I think this wonderful recording will show you so many things about Ben Ferencz. Being 100, you can task him with any task that comes up with you. And he's the guy who hardly ever says no. We will ask Don about it, because Don might have different experience with his father when it comes to saying no. But, you know, he obliges it, and he can do it because, you know, he turning 60 and being in the law since 27 gives Ben such a wonderful perspective, where the times of despair, the Second World War, were followed by the times of unprecedented positivity and optimism in the world. And this part, I think 1945 onwards years were probably in recorded history of humanity the most positive and thriving years. There was some sort of positive habit that we are going to manage it as a humanity by following and democratic rules, the rule of law, and all sorts of things. And then Ben Ferencz also testified the revival of international criminal justice after Tokyo and Nuremberg tribunals, and he was very, very active in lobbying for the permanent court, the ICC. And then now Ben is still with us when we share despair about the future of international criminal law. And you wouldn't be surprised if I tell you that he would be probably the most optimistic and positive about the future than any one of us. So his experience means something. And I would like you to listen to him. It is very short, but as ever, very powerful and memorable. So if there are no other questions, I think Bester could turn to the film so that we can watch it. No questions? No comments?
Let's go.
You're now ready to hear the presentation by the prosecution.
This was the tragic fulfillment of a program of intolerance and arrogance. Vengeance is not our goal, nor do we seek merely a just retribution. We ask this court to affirm by international penal action man's right to live in peace and dignity, regardless of his race or creed. The case we present is a plea of humanity to law. We shall establish, beyond the realm of doubt, facts which, before the dark decade of the Third Reich, would have seemed incredible. Courts will show that the slaughter committed by these defendants was dictated not by military necessity, but by that supreme perversion of thought, the Nazi theory of the master race. We shall show that these deeds of men in uniform were the methodical execution of long-range plans to destroy ethnic, national, political, and religious groups which stood condemned in the Nazi mind. Genocide, the extermination of whole categories of human beings, was a foremost instrument of the Nazi doctrine.
I was then 27 years old. I had met Lemkin when he came to Nuremberg, urging everyone he could talk to recognize that a new crime had been committed his entire family had been killed simply because they were Jews. And he felt that to take a whole group and exterminate them couldn't just go under the heading of mass murder. This was a specialized type of mass murder, and he invented the Greek term then, which was genocide. And I was so impressed by his sincerity and by his tragedy that I decided that although it was not listed as one of the punishable crimes in any of our statutes, I would use it anyway because it was so appropriate. And that's how it came about, that you are listening to the first time that the word genocide was used in a criminal prosecution. I mentioned it several times later in the course of preparing the final and the opening statements, but that was something which I felt should be done. I did not anticipate that the world would continue committing genocides all around the globe, despite my best effort at an early age to have it condemned as an international crime. Let me explain a little bit more then about the Einsatzgruppen case. I had originally been hired by General Telford Taylor, representing the Pentagon, to do the research for the 12 Nuremberg trials, which had been decided upon after the International Military Tribunal trial against Goering and company was ended. And Taylor, who had inquired about my background, knew that I was a Harvard Law graduate who had been assigned as a corporal or a sergeant in the Army to go into the concentration camps as they were being liberated and collect evidence of the crimes. And that was my assignment. I believe there, too, I was the first war crimes investigator in World War II. The horrors that I personally witnessed are quite indescribable. I hope that students will have already checked the records out. Thousands of people murdered, grounds covered with dead bodies, bones piled up, which had once been humans, in front of the crematoria, waiting to be burned. I have seen all of that. I have also dug up bodies with my hands of Allied flyers who had been shot down when they were flying over German territory, and they were murdered by the German mob when they landed on the ground. So I have seen the horrors of warfare. And I was honorably discharged after about 3 years of military service from the beaches of Normandy to the final battle of the Bulge. They awarded me 5 battle stars for not having been killed or wounded, but it had left its mark on me. Not all wounds are visible. And I soon determined that I would have to spend the rest of my life trying to pay respect to Mr. Lemkin by condemning genocide wherever it occurred, by trying to stop war making. And that's exactly what I have been doing all these years. And I am grateful to all of you for having invited me again to come to Dubrovnik and share my views with you as to what has happened to that dream. My earliest efforts were in finding out what the facts were, and that was to study everything that had been written. I practically lived in the United Nations. I read to every library, and I produced a whole series of books. The first 2 volumes was on defining aggression, because if aggression was the supreme international crime, as the International Military Tribunal and Justice Jackson held, then it would be necessary to be clear, how did you define that crime? The Americans were then, had changed their enthusiasm for the trials, and were looking for excuses to avoid having to define it in any acceptable way. The next 2 volumes was the creation of an international criminal court. A court can't function without a definition of the crimes, and you cannot have an effect of the crimes if you don't have a court to hold the people accountable who've committed those crimes. And so I wrote 2 volumes on that. And then I wrote 2 volumes on enforcing international law, because if you don't enforce it, it has no meaning. And unfortunately, the world has not yet started work on the 3rd step of the law, courts, and enforcement system that you need to have a more peaceful world. I don't know if they will ever start doing that, if they don't suddenly realize that it's in everybody's benefit to avoid war and to substitute law for it, which is my slogan, law, not war. If they fail to realize that, they are in danger all of your lives, because our capacity to kill people exceeds our capacity to safeguard them through our institutions. And we have been very weak in all that. So let me just join up with you a bit. It had been my hope when I received the kind invitation of Sir Geoffrey Nice and his aide Nena to come to Dubrovnik again to share my experiences with a master class. But I am now 100 years old, and I hope that the tape will have to replace me, at least in the classroom. I want to make clear that it was my hope in the prosecution of the Einsatzgruppen, special extermination squads, to help move toward a new rule of law which would protect everyone from being subjected to that type of genocide, which is what it was, and that the rule of law would be applied, and that it would depend really upon whether we could stop war making, because war making itself, which has been glorified for centuries, is a form of genocide. It's always there to kill your adversary, and we have to really change the way people think about the use of armed force. The United Nations Charter tried to do that by saying that you could only settle your disputes by peaceful means, and they listed a dozen different means of compromise and arbitration and so on, whereby you could have the instrumentality of an independent agency like the United Nations to settle whatever the dispute might be between 2 sovereign states. But it didn't work out that way. And the reason it didn't work out that way in the first instance is what I consider to be the failure of the Security Council to carry out its mandate. They betrayed the hopes that had been rested on them after we'd killed at least 50 million people in World War II. Instead of deciding it on the basis of the general welfare, they almost invariably, the Security Council permanent members almost invariably decided what they felt was best for their own particular country. And the result was, as you know, genocide continues in various parts of the world. It's not that we have forgotten about it, but we have not been able to generate enough public support to make it possible to override the objections of those who prefer war to law. And there are many such. Since they have glorified armies and navies and marching bands for centuries, it would be unreasonable to expect it to be reversed in the course of one human life. I've done the best I can for one human being. I was born in Transylvania, a country which no longer exists. It was part of Hungary and Romania. My sister was born in the same bed as I was. She was a Hungarian. I was born a year and a half later. I was a Romanian. And I learned very early in life that it doesn't matter what you call the country or where you're born. What matters is how you treat its people. And in my case, both Hungary and Romania were anti-Semitic, and I thought my parents would be well advised to look for a safe haven in some other country. And we came to America as immigrants, poor immigrants. The house we left in Romania, was then called, had no running water, had no electricity. There was no employment. It was no place to stay. So we took whatever ship we could get to go to the United States. The only reason we traveled third class was because there was no fourth class. We landed at the Statue of Liberty, and I've never forgotten it. Send me your poor, your homeless, the wretched refuse on your teeming shores. Send these to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. Well, that was about 99 years ago when I came under those lanterns. And unfortunately, the United States, which is a great democracy, means that it has differences of opinion, and that's as it should be. But where the opinion overrides the general welfare, then it's an opinion which is bound to get them into more trouble than save them. And we see that in the United States today. We have a far-right opinion, which is very conservative. We have another opinion, which is very more liberal, I would say. And the politics is such that the president, for example, is elected by a very small majority. And he must depend upon being able to get more than the 50%. And if he knows that he advocates a policy of peace, which is not very romantic, instead of war, that the one who is advocating war is more likely to have a small majority to support that point of view. And so the president, or would-be president, has to be ready to make a compromise and to go around politically and see if he can win over the opinion of those who would control the election itself, in fact. So we face that in connection with genocide as well. The Genocide Convention was adopted unanimously by the General Assembly of the United Nations and given out for ratification. 40 years later, the United States was able to ratify the Genocide Convention. And even then, with all kinds of loopholes built in, so that they could get past the majority of the U.S. Senate, which was essential. 40 years of waiting for what should have been so obvious after the First World War. Well, we're back in the same shoes today. And now I'm more concerned than I was even then, because I have been aware for some years now that the United States, and I can talk about it because it's become public knowledge almost, the United States has the capacity from cyberspace today to cut off the electrical grid on planet Earth. The Russians can do the same, the Chinese can do the same, I don't know who else can do the same. But what that means is that if they shut off the lights and everything else, what happens? I asked the general who gave me this information when it was still confidential years ago, how long would it take for everybody to die? And he said, well, I'm not familiar with any studies which have been made on that subject, but my belief is it would depend upon how much water they had. If they had enough water, they probably could survive for about a week or so. And I sort of shuddered. A week of survival. And that's what's going to happen in the next war, because surely if one starts, another one is going to jump in too. So ever since that conversation, I have been even more attuned to the idea we have to find a better way of settling our differences than to go out, as we do now. We send young people out to kill other young people they didn't even know, who never did them any harm. and they continue killing each other until they get tired of that. Then each side declares victory, then they rest for a while, then they start again. That has been the pattern. And in the meanwhile, they spend billions of dollars for more weapons to kill more people, instead of using the money to take care of the legitimate complaints of those who are prepared to do what we call terrorist acts in order to preserve their own life or their standard of living. Instead of using the money to meet those legitimate complaints, they buy the money to kill more people with more dangerous weapons. So that, dear friends, is the world in which you live. We have seen our share of genocides. The first notable one where we were able to create a court to deal with it was Rwanda. I was introduced to the new Rwandan ambassador some years ago, and at the UN. And when I was introduced, I shook her hand and I said, I want to apologize. She said, what for? I want to apologize for all the lawyers, for all the American public. Everybody who was counted knew that it was likely to happen, and they let the genocide happen. After the Jewish Holocaust, they should have known better, but they let it happen again in Rwanda, where again they killed 800,000 people in about 10 days. This is a disgrace to the legal community to begin with, and to the public of the world. And I've said I felt guilty about that, and I think I owe you an apology. When she got her chance to be the speaker of the day, she got up and noted that Ben Ferencz had apologized for all of you. Well, apology isn't good enough. We've got to set in motion the steps that we need, the law, the courts, and the enforcement mechanisms, which we don't have. So how do you do that? Well, I've been thinking about it for a long time. You have to change the hearts and minds of the public. If you don't change the heart, you can't change the mind. And they have to realize that it's not cowardice to compromise and to be considerate of the other fellow's point of view. Is not something which you should avoid. It's something which is essential. The principal causes of all wars, and I've studied that as well. First place, it's religion. Second one, it's called nationalism. And the third one is the economic circumstances. And if they don't have what they believe to be their entitlements, they're ready to kill and die for it. Well, as long as they're ready to kill and die, and there's no alternative, you end up with the world that not only do you have it, but beware, it gets worse as time goes by. And my concern at age 100 is not with my welfare, it's concerned with yours. And so I hope that all the people who are listening to this or watching this broadcast will know that I have no axe to grind other than the welfare of all of humanity. I wrote a little book called Planethood, and the theme of that book was, we are all inhabitants of one small planet, and we must share the resources on that planet so that everyone can live in peace and dignity regardless of their race or creed. That was my goal. That is my goal. That must be your goal if you are to survive. So I welcome Sir Geoffrey and his friends for calling me to state my view. I've stated my view. I will continue to state my view as long as I can. I hope that some of you will recognize that what I say is correct. And we'll do whatever you can. There's room for everybody. Doing nothing and complaining is no solution to any problem. You must have the courage to stand up for what you know is right, to vote down those who are of opposite opinion, which you know is dangerous to everyone. And hopefully, we'll have a more peaceful world. I still remember my closing statement in the Einsatzgruppen Trial, which proved that millions of Jews had been murdered by these special extermination squads. And in my closing appeal to the court, I said the defendants in the dock were the cruel executioners whose terror wrote the blackest page in human history. Death was their tool, and life was their toy. If these men be immune, then law has lost its meaning, and man must live in fear. That is still my view.
Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me as well. And, you know, I'd seen that tape that my dad did, and I'm astonished actually watching it at how at age 100, he's so incredibly lucid. Despite the fact, by the way, that probably the reason he had that piece of paper in front of him was to be able to remember your names. Other than that, it's all extemporaneous. You know, he knows his stuff. It's fascinating to me too, you know, that he opened his case with, among other things, the words, "The case we present is a plea of humanity to law." And I like to say that today, in a very real sense, the tables are turned, because in particular, in the statute, the International Criminal Court statute, the Statute of Rome, we have a plea not necessarily of humanity to law, but of law to humanity. We have the law. It's there, it's in black and white, and it is effectively calling out to humankind to get behind the institution and the structure that we have, at least with respect to trying to enforce the law. And of course, I'm guessing that some of you know more and less about how the International Criminal Court functions. It is wholly reliant on the goodwill and the cooperation of states. It is not a big supranational policeman that can go enforcing its own edicts. So of course, my dad touched on that, you know, in his talk. By the way, just by way of aside, it's not really germane to the topic we're talking about today, but I can't resist saying something about it. I'm sure most of you know exactly what my dad was talking about when he talked about the Statue of Liberty. And the Statue of Liberty, of course, has been for a very long time associated with the poem which my dad referred to by a woman, Emma Lazarus, which is on the pedestal at the base of the Statue of Liberty and has been there since the early 1900s. But the Statue of Liberty itself, and it's rarely talked about, and I think probably not known by many people, was not originally intended as a beacon of hope to foreigners coming to the United States. If you can get an opportunity to look closely at an up-close photo of the Statue of Liberty, you'll see that Lady Liberty is standing on something. She's standing on broken chains. And the Statue of Liberty was given by France to the United States after the Civil War, after the emancipation of the slaves in the United States. And that is what those chains represent. It was in fact a token to demonstrate the freedom and the liberty of people who had been enslaved previously in the US. So just a small historical tidbit I thought I would throw in. I'd like to actually say a few things about my own experience, not so much because I want you to know about me, but rather because it may mean something to some of you who are young in your careers and interested and have a thirst for international justice and the well-being of humankind. I was born in Nuremberg, as were my three sisters. My dad stayed on after the war. He was working for restitution organizations to try to rehabilitate the victims who had been suffering during the Holocaust. And he was involved in instituting various reparations programs where the German government paid billions, effectively billions of dollars to survivors, and they are still in fact paying. But I was born in Germany, came back to the United States, grew up in New Rochelle, New York, a suburb of New York City. I went to university. The Vietnam War was still on. I had to register for the draft on my 18th birthday. I registered as a conscientious objector because, why? Because I thought the Vietnam War was so offensive. In fact, I tore up the papers before I filled them out because I saw a movie called The Pawnbroker. Maybe some of you have seen it, probably very few of you, but there's an interesting scene in that movie, and it's about a survivor of the Holocaust. And in that movie, it shows the actor Rod Steiger, who is playing the husband of a Jewish woman. They're both in a concentration camp. And he has his head put through, as I recall it, a window smashed, watching his wife be raped by German soldiers. And I remember going back to my university room and literally tearing up the papers that I thought I was going to file as a conscientious objector, and I threw them in the garbage can because I realized that there are some forces that are so evil that people need to stand up and be willing to use whatever force is necessary to overcome them. So that was just part of my own upbringing. My undergraduate degree was in peace studies. And I then went on to teach elementary school for a number of years. I learned some very important things. I learned when you're trying to explain something to a child or to anyone that they don't know about, it's very good to begin at the beginning and not assume they know what you're talking about. I also learned that you can never win an argument with a 5-year-old child. I then went to business school and law school, and I came out and I worked in the commercial world for over 20 years in the tax field, and I became an international tax executive, working for multi-billion-dollar publicly traded companies as their senior tax executive, flying all over the world, arguing tax cases, negotiating tax deals, and such. Until one day, I quit. I just went in and resigned from the job that I had. It was a very high-paying job. And why did I do that? I did it because my dad and I had created a small private foundation called the Planethood Foundation, which he funded with his retirement savings because he figured he had already outlived the age of his father, and he wanted to use his own funds for the betterment of mankind. And so we established this small foundation, and I thought, well, I'm going to work now more on the international justice side and get back to what I wanted to do. And this is the part of the story that I think may be of interest to some of you. I was very fortunate because I already had a commercial career, and so I had some independent economic assets to rely on. I didn't have to rely on getting paid to do what I was doing. But what I did is I began attending meetings that were being held in the New York City area of a group called the Special Working Group on the Crime of Aggression, which was charged with helping the International Criminal Court develop a definition of the crime of aggression and also the mechanisms by which that court would be able to finally hear a case. And they were doing this because when the International Criminal Court statute was put together in 1998, the crime of aggression was still considered so contentious that even though the court was given jurisdiction over genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, and ostensibly also over the crime of aggression, aggression hadn't been defined, it hadn't been put in the statute, and there was a caveat that said even though the court had jurisdiction over aggression, it couldn't exercise that jurisdiction until and unless a definition was later put into the statute and until jurisdictional provisions were put in. And I mention it to you all because what I did was I actually transformed myself from basically somebody who was not involved in the international justice field to somebody who, through my own reading extensively about the whole history of the crime of aggression, became somebody who was considered an expert in the field. And I wound up helping to advise, as many NGO representatives were doing, those who were working, the diplomats who were working on this. And for example, Jeffrey was asking me at the beginning of the session, just before some of you came on, what have I been up to lately? I was scheduled this summer to lecture at Oxford. I was scheduled to lecture for the Nuremberg Principles Academy in Nuremberg. I was lectured to lecture for the 4th time to a group of NATO lawyers who have week-long training sessions in a town in Germany called Oberammergau. They were all canceled. And I mention it to you for a reason. My point is that if you want to really apply yourself in a particular area, you literally don't need to do it under the tutelage of someone else or even as part of an academic institution. If you want to get involved in a field that is of interest to you, you can really convert yourself through your own, blood, sweat, and tears and time to be dangerous, know something and become a little bit dangerous, shall we say. And I want to actually share with you very, very briefly. I don't want to really get into the whole history of the crime of aggression because it's something which, unless you specialize in it, it wouldn't be necessarily of general interest. But I want to tell you something very interesting about this NATO course. I was invited to lecture there by somebody who was an American involved with NATO, who heard me talking very briefly and said, you know, I'd like to have you come and talk to these NATO lawyers. They get technical training mostly on the rules of war, the law of war, how to kill people legally in a military setting. And what's interesting to me is that they invited me to come and speak. And what I said to them was basically, after giving them the whole lecture on the whole history of the crime of aggression and its current status in international law, I said, if there ever is a case where there is a trial for the crime of aggression, it's going to be people like you in this room who know something on the inside about who knew what, when, how, where, who were the decision makers who made the decision to go to war. For example, some of you will certainly know that when George Bush and Tony Blair decided to have a coalition to go into Iraq in 2003, that invasion was completely illegal in international law. So my point that's so interesting to me is that here I am, I walk into the NATO guys and I look them in the eye and I say, you are the people who are going to have to testify and ask yourselves, what do you stand for? And quite frankly, I didn't really expect to be invited back a second time, let alone a third or a fourth time. And it's actually quite heartwarming for me to know that the people who at least were responsible for that program didn't mind me coming and telling the truth as I saw it. So I want to encourage you, just as a note of positivity, to feel brave enough to speak up for what you believe and to pursue the dreams that you want to pursue. Now, the question of the future is, it reminds me a little bit of one of my professors when I was in law and business school, when students used to say, in answer to his questions, things that he thought were slightly silly, he'd look at them and he'd say, you're kidding, right? And if somebody asks me to predict the future, my reaction is similar. But we can say something about the past. Some of you may, if you're statisticians, may have heard of the expression which statisticians use and economists use of something called linear progression analysis. It's a fancy word for saying basically you can graph things on a chart and you can look to see if there's a progression which may help you predict from point A to point B, C, D, and E. We can look back and we can see the progress that's been made. My dad didn't really go to any lengths in this particular talk that you saw, but he likes to say why he's optimistic. And he's optimistic because, as I was saying to some of you just before we got started, in the 1700s or so, 1600s, 1700s, people were being burned alive as witches, even in the so-called civilized countries. And we've come a long way since then. It wasn't very long ago that we had the emancipation that I mentioned earlier in the United States. People could own other people. We look at that today, it's totally outrageous. In the United States, women couldn't vote. Same in most countries. So we've seen a lot of development. Nina touched on the fact that after World War II, there was this great surge, this great positive feeling going forward that we would have a United Nations. We would do something to make the world better. And my takeaway from that is when we see areas and periods of tremendous trauma, unfortunately, it seems to take trauma to move the world forward in many instances. Rwanda, the same thing. Yugoslavia, same thing. These were traumatic events which provoked and incented the world to go forward to try to do something about it. And of course, what are we really doing when we, quote, punish perpetrators? That's retroactive punishment. I mean, punishment for crimes that have already been committed, but it also has a prospective intention, which is to deter potential future perpetrators. Now, something you don't hear my dad talk about very often. In fact, I have never heard him speak of it, but you should know it. The Einsatzgruppen defendants who were convicted by him. And oh, by the way, just to round out the story a little bit, somebody discovered all of these reports from the field about these Einsatzgruppen killing squads. They were basically signed confessions of every single one of his defendants. So he had a pretty good track record. He started the case by putting into evidence all of the confessions of mass murder on a scale hitherto unknown. And he convicted the guys. He didn't call any witnesses. But the Einsatzgruppen trial was part of 12 trials put on by the Americans after the Four Powers trial, the International Military Tribunal put on by the French, the British, the Soviet Union, and the United States was followed by 12 trials. The Americans had a lot of people they convicted, but by 1958, every single one of those defendants was released, just released from jail. And the reason they were released was because of realpolitik, geopolitics. You had the Soviet Union, which had moved in to Eastern Europe, and the United States wanted to reconstitute the divisions of the German army as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. And it is not spoken about very often today. You hardly ever hear anybody talk about the fact that all of the subsequent preceding defendants and convicts were all released into society. And ironically, I would tell you another little tidbit, a little story. My father very often talks about, and some of you may be aware that there's a documentary film about my dad called Prosecuting Evil. I don't know if any of you have seen it, but I mention it because he talks at length about his view of who were the perpetrators of these crimes. What were they like as human beings? Were they monsters? Were they not monsters? And he says they weren't monsters. By the way, I should also mention, this is not by way of an infomercial. If any of you would like to get a private link to this documentary, because you can get it on Netflix in the US, but not here. If anybody would like to hear it in its entirety, please send me an email, or Jeffrey, maybe I can organize that through you or through Nana. Anyway, to come back, there was something I wanted to say about my dad and the Einsatzgruppen trial. And as so often happens, I got talking about one thing and then I think about something else. So I'll have to come back to it. But in any event, you know, the guys who were in those trials were caught up in a false ideology. And my dad talks about that at some length, and it's worth people hearing. The story I wanted to tell you about the Einsatzgruppen trial, and referring back to this, is that my father talks about in that movie the fact that none of the defendants ever apologized, and that his entire time in Germany, no one ever apologized to him. And on his 100th birthday, as you can imagine, my dad was getting emails from all over the world. And I was helping him process the responses to those emails because he's not so great on the computer anymore. In fact, he never really was. Dad, if you're listening, sorry. But something happened on his birthday that had never happened before. And I was really choked with emotion. I may even get a little emotional now thinking about it. He got an email from a woman who was the grandniece of one of his defendants. Martin Sandberger was the defendant, and he gets this email out of the blue, quite a lengthy, very thoughtful note, wishing him, of course, all the best for his birthday and apologizing. And it was fascinating what she wrote. She said that her granduncle was somebody who was considered sort of the black sheep now of the family, that he was a striver. He was a very bright man, by the way, lawyer. And she said that he was interested in advancing his own career, to the great shame of the family. And there were others in the family, ministers and others, who felt very differently than he did. But it was quite fascinating that she put into context a little bit about her family, and at the same time, that here on my father's 100th birthday, he finally, for the very first time, got an apology from somebody related to his defendants at the Einsatzgruppen trial. And that was the story that I wanted to tell you. Anyway, okay, so what did I do? I got involved with the International Criminal Court. I have been lecturing as an advocate on bringing the crime of aggression within the jurisdiction of the court. If anybody wants to know about it, they could send me an email. I'm happy to refer them to information on this subject. And in fact, in 2017, the crime of aggression was voted on in terms of whether it would be activated before the International Criminal Court, and it now has been activated before the court. The court has limited jurisdiction. It is on a voluntary basis. But I would like to tell you a little side story about this. For four powers at Nuremberg, I mentioned earlier, included the British and the French. The British and the French are the only two countries of those four powers that are actually members of the International Criminal Court. And neither of those two countries has ratified the crime of aggression amendments, meaning that until they do ratify those amendments, take them through the legislative process of approval, the people of Great Britain and of France are immune and effectively above the law with respect to the crime of aggression, unless the Security Council should refer a case. And I was quoted in The Guardian just before the vote occurred at the UN, saying that you would think that of all people, the British and the French would be supporting this, that it was basically the height of hypocrisy for them not to. And there's another point with respect to this, and I've been in touch with Owen Bocott, who is a reporter for The Guardian, on possibly doing something in the future on this. Obviously, everything has been eclipsed in the UK by both first Brexit and now, of course, COVID-19. But the point that I want to make in the British public in particular is that it is such an irony and a double standard that ordinary men and women in uniform can be held accountable before a court of law if they commit war crimes, for example, going out and shooting an innocent civilian during a military conflict. And yet the leaders, the political leaders, who send them out to fight and die in complete contempt for and violation of the international law prohibiting the use of force in the first place, are completely above the law. And my hope is that if the public can be made aware, if the mothers and fathers whose sons and daughters are being sent out to fight and potentially die can understand that the leaders who are sending them should be held to the same standard before the law, that perhaps they'll be less eager to send young people out to fight and die, knowing that if they send them in violation of international law, they themselves can be brought before the bar of justice. So anyway, so that's sort of my shtick. Where the future is, well, you're looking at the future on the screen, except for the old people on the screen. You're the future. You know more about what's going to happen than I do. And of course, it's an unsteady and uncertain time that we're living in now. But I would say this, there's a wonderful quote from Winston Churchill, perhaps some of you have heard. But before I give you that quote, I'll give you another quote that is often attributed to Einstein, although if you Google it, you'll find out Einstein didn't really say it. Some of you have heard it. It says that insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result. Well, we do live in a crazy world, because we see that in a lawless society, we have killing, we have death, we have hardship, we have heartache, we have mass migration of people out of danger zones, famine zones, which could be controlled if we did things differently. Now, the second quote is the one to cheer you up, from Winston Churchill. Churchill is reputed to have said that success is the ability to go from failure to failure without losing enthusiasm. And I would leave you with that.
Thank you so much, Don. I will try to have my video as well, but I'm not quite sure how it works. Yes, for Jeffrey and me and Sonia, who I hope is with us, listening to Ben and Don Ferencz is actually a lesson in humility. After listening to Ben, all of us just seem and appear as wannabes, but there is nothing against to be wannabe your whole life. If you really believe in something that I completely agree with the linear future and the absurdity of trying to predict it. But you know, from Ben's example and yours example, what we do is that non-action leaves the future to be someone else's future. And that as long as we believe that our own involvement, participation, and counting failure after failure as something, you know, that is probably part of the past, we do influence the future, and it becomes much more transaction than, you know, being recipients of someone else's actions. And I think what we have learned, I at least appreciate so much from Ben's and your example and Planethood, that unless you are trying and repeating and trying again, you won't have any influence. So control is probably something for politicians, but influence something that we, all well-meant people, probably can count as our ownership. And I hope young people listening to this can draw on your examples, worthy examples of trying and mobilizing, and that winning hearts of people is as important, even more important, as Ben said, that winning the minds of people. And I am extremely grateful that we are finishing this very demanding course with these wise words and hopeful and optimistic views that, yes, if you do something, you can at least have some influence in very important processes. So, Dawn, I know that you have to leave us shortly. And I would ask you whether you can bear 5 minutes with us, just in the case our young audience has something very directly to ask you.
Of course.
It's your call, so 5 minutes.
Of course.
Please, the audience. Is there anything you want to ask?
Before that, Nana, just before that, can I ask that Sapan and Benjamin turn on their videos if they can, out of respect for the speaker. Buzzer Chorus has just featured. Nana, do you know who? Ah, there we are. Thank you very much. That's good. So questions. Sorry, Nana, to interrupt for that.
No, it's fine.
And
questions?
Questions.
Well, thank you so much for this speech and for sharing all your experience. What I think my comment would be, what I realized by listening both to Ben and you, is that in the end, it's if we believe in something and if we think that, or if we fight for something and want to change it, it's up to us. So there are institutions and there are structures, but the important thing is that we always try to be down to earth and that we fight for it regardless of the difficulties that may seem to be ahead of us. And I think this is really important to make clear. And I thank you for giving us these examples, and where you also said that if you want to become an expert, then it's possible and you just have to do it. So I think this is an important message to me personally.
Thank you, Francesca. Next person. Yes, please, Nathan.
I think just to kind of, well, first of all, thank you for being with us today. And to kind of just to echo, I guess, what Francesca was saying is that I think sometimes people, myself included, feel that it can be a bit overwhelming, I guess, to sort of think about how you do something, how you do anything. And I think we're also experiencing a point in sort of history and culture at the moment where there's certain things and issues and problems that are going on in our society that makes you just then think, how do you do something? How do you change anything? And how do you get involved in trying to create a change? And I think it's really encouraging to hear your story, and obviously also the story of your father, and just thinking how you're right. Like if you believe in something and if you want to just do something, there are many ways of going about it. There's not like a direct path that you suddenly have to be on, that you have to do a certain thing. And that if you stick by something in your beliefs, eventually, it definitely takes you somewhere. And I think that's really encouraging for me, at least anyway, in this particular time with all the different things that are going on, so socially, politically, legally, that actually there are ways that you can work to make a change in society. So thank you.
Thank you, Nathan. Adam?
Thank you very, very much, Tom, and also to your father. I think this is just fascinating and so inspiring. And I'm just thinking on that last quote from Churchill, just the idea of failing but not losing enthusiasm, not losing that focus. In your career, has there been a time when you felt like you've lost yourself from the wood, from the trees, for example, or you feel like you're losing motivation to really keep pushing forward on these such important issues? And how did you get over that?
Well, I don't know that I've ever come to a point where I felt defeated or so discouraged that I didn't feel that I could continue to try to make progress in terms of trying to do at least what I could do. But I will share a little story with you. I mentioned this whole business about the crime of aggression has been my primary focus over quite a number of years. I started in 2005 getting involved in this, and there was a big review conference in Kampala, Uganda in 2010, where all the delegates from the ICC countries came together. And on the eve of that conference, I was invited to the home of Christian Veneweser, the ambassador of Liechtenstein, who had been not only the president of what's called the Assembly of States Parties, which is that's the governing group of countries that are all members of the International Criminal Court. Today it's about 122 members, but he was also the chairman of the working group on the crime of aggression, which had been responsible for putting together the definitions leading up to this review conference. And it was really a great joy and a privilege for me to be invited to this guy's home for a private dinner in New York with about 8 other people there, including the then legal advisor to the U.S. Secretary of State. And it was a very private dinner. I was invited as the sole non-governmental person there to basically argue with the U.S. legal advisor over the U.S. position on the crime of aggression. And at that dinner, the U.S. legal advisor made it very clear that the U.S., which has not joined the court, by the way, that even though the U.S. had not joined the court, they were still coming to Kampala as an observer country, that even though they were not members of the court, they made clear to the chairman of this whole review conference that as far as the United States of America was concerned, they wanted to see no action at all taken in Kampala. In other words, they wanted the review conference to fail with respect to bringing to fruition this whole effort to bring the crime of aggression within the court's jurisdiction. I said earlier when some of us were chatting that I learned or at the beginning of my talk, that I learned as a kindergarten teacher, if you want people to know something, you should start at the beginning. So I won't assume that all of you know how Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. I'm sure you've all heard the story that Lincoln was shot in the head. You may not know that he was in the middle of watching a show with his wife at the theater. And we have an American expression, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the show? And that was exactly what I said to Christian Veneweser after this dinner as it was adjourning. Other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you like the show? Because we went into Kampala literally thinking that the U.S. was going to put a stake right through the heart of the effort to bring the crime of aggression forward. So that was a moment, shall we say, in time where I thought, this is not going to happen. And yet, at the review conference, it overcame the odds, and it did happen. I learned subsequently, I mentioned Britain and France earlier, not being too big, not really being fans of the crime of aggression. I learned later, about, maybe 8 years after the review conference, from the British delegate at that conference, that in fact the French had approached the British to agree or to offer that if the 2 of those countries would agree not to join in consensus, meaning a 100% approval by the entire body, that if the British approached the French approached the British and said, if you will join us, we will kill this whole thing right here and now in Kampala. So it came this close to not happening. And I would say going into the Kampala Review Conference was the proverbial darkest hour for me personally, thinking this isn't going to happen. And yet something did come out of Kampala, which was, although a small step, a step forward. So fortunately for me, I haven't really felt overwhelmed with defeat. Having said that, I should add that having worked on this so feverishly from 2005 until it became activated in 2017, it became activated in 2018, but until that vote, having worked on this, for 12 years or so, there was a bit of an anticlimax afterward you know, you've heard the expression for women who give birth, postpartum depression. When you're working on something so feverishly and it's taking all of your time, and then it happens, it's almost like, what do I do now? And of course, with respect to the crime of aggression, there's still a lot to be done, which is to get more countries to ratify, to continue to, if you will, name and shame or work to bring this within the public domain. So my work is still cut out for me.
Thanks. Holly has a question.
Hi. Yeah, I also wanted to thank you for this. It was definitely saving the best till last. Probably the most inspiring and thought-provoking day I think I've had on the course so far. But my question is, you seemingly kind of place the emphasis on public point of view as having the greatest influence perhaps in changing or sort of influencing the future. But how, or what would you say is the best way of doing this when it's sort of really against states' interests to educate people in that way? And would you say that it would have to get to a breaking point, or, you know, what's the best way of doing it?
Yeah, I think that's really, that question gets to the heart. It's almost like a chicken and an egg question. Is it the public that influences the politicians, or is it the politicians who influence the public? And, you know, when I lecture on the crime of aggression, I frequently close with a quote that, although it is something I reference within the context of the crime of aggression, is applicable across the board. And I'll share it with you. It's a quote from somebody by the name of Herman Goering. Herman Goering was actually the lead named defendant at the International Military Tribunal. He was a former Reichsmarshal. He was the #2 guy under Hitler for a while. At the end of the war, he was actually running for his life because Hitler had thought he was trying to take the reins of power and had basically put out a fatwa, they didn't call it a fatwa, obviously, on Herman Goering. And Goering was very happy to surrender to the Allies, and he did so by turning over his golden gun. You know, he thought, and this is not the quote I want to leave you with, but I also quote him often as having said that war is like a football game. Whoever loses gives his opponent his hand, and everything is forgiven. This is a quote from Goering. But the quote that I want to share with you is something else that he said, a very chilling and stark assessment of how easy it is to drag any nation into war. And as an American who saw my country go into the Iraq invasion in 2003, ostensibly because Saddam Hussein had, quote, weapons of mass destruction, these words ring particularly true. He said, naturally, the common people don't want war. He said, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor for that matter in Germany. He said, that is understood. But after all, it is the leaders of the country who make policy. And it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a fascist state or a parliamentary democracy. And these are his words, voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. And then he added, it works the same way in any country. So we need to get, at least in democratic societies, we need to get the people to elect leaders who are not, how shall we say, unreliable, liars, disrespectful of international law, disrespectful of human rights and decency. And unfortunately, as an American, I have said to my wife, and I mean it, that if Donald Trump gets reelected president, I will find a way to change my citizenship.
Thank you for that answer. And a couple of things, everybody. I first heard that quote from Don. I didn't know it, that Goering quote. And I was intended to keep it in my wallet. I don't at the moment have it, in order to read it out to anybody who would benefit from it. But I don't meet enough politicians at the high level doing dangerous things to do it. But it is a phenomenally valuable quotation. And if I can dig it out from my records, Don having drawn it to my attention, we'll shove it somewhere so that you can all have it in writing. In the absence of any other questions, and I don't, yes, Righto, Sapan. Yes, your question, please.
Thank you, first of all, for a very inspiring lecture by both yourself and your father. I wanted to ask about your work in relation to the crime of aggression, and whether it is a, I don't know what the adjective is to describe, but Anglocentric specialty. So is it the case that it is only British and American or other Western academics that are interested in this question, or is it a global pursuit? And similarly, by extension, are there movements and pressure groups around the world that are evenly distributed, pushing for membership of the ICC and international criminal law enforcement, or does it remain more of a Western pursuit? And if it does remain a Western pursuit, what would be your advice to us to how to spread concern for this issue across the globe?
That's a really important question because it touches on a reality. I had never thought of it as, or thought about the question of whether or not the ICC is a, quote, Western pursuit per se. But if you look at the number of countries that are member countries of the ICC, you see, of course, that a very big Western power, the United States, is not a member. Many of the other, shall we say, allies of the United States, virtually every country in NATO, with the exception of the United States and Turkey, are members of the ICC. You have South American countries, Latin countries in the ICC. You have the European Union strongly in the ICC. It's missing India, it's missing China, it's missing Russia, it's missing almost the entirety of the Arab countries. And I will share with you an experience I had at a conference in Doha, in Qatar. I was there asked to speak on a panel where the ICC was putting on a program trying to stimulate Arab countries to join the ICC. And that's who the audience was. And it was very interesting for me to hear what the representatives had to say, and some of it was fairly informal. Basically what they said was, don't kid us. If it weren't such a formal setting, I would use the word I'm really thinking of. But they basically said, don't kid us about a system of international justice when you don't enforce the UN's resolutions against Israel, but now you come to us and you say, join the International Criminal Court, because their perception was what you sort of not intimated, but their perception was that the ICC is a tool of Western imperialism. That's actually what they were saying. They were saying, don't kid us. When you start enforcing the laws, when the United States joins, when Russia joins, when you join and subject yourselves to the yoke of the law, then come see us and talk to us about this international justice system. Some of you will probably be familiar with the quote, well-known quote from Thucydides from quite some time ago. He was the historian of the Peloponnesian Wars, the Greek Wars, who said, the strong do what they can and the weak endure what they must. We have a different purported ideology of justice today, at least in the United States and Western countries. If you go to the United States Supreme Court, you'll see 4 words etched in stone over the portico: equal justice under law. We apply that in theory domestically, and of course it is not in actuality applied as equal justice under law, but at least that's the goal. I don't want to depress you, but I happen to have a little article. Let's see if I hold it right up to the screen. Can you read what it says?
This isn't what the 21st.
Yeah, essentially what's supposed to look like. I have trouble reading it backwards on the screen. I'll tell you what it's from. I'm going to give you a little tiny quote from it. It's from Time magazine. from March 2014, and I've kept it all these years. It says, I'll just read you there's a little highlighted thing I highlighted. It says, international relations are still about who can do what to whom. So Thucydides, if he were reading this, he would say, I told you so. Anyway, but to come back to your point, there is an effort. There's a group called the Coalition for the International Criminal Court. You can Google them if you like. They have, I don't know, maybe 2,000 members or so, NGO organizations around the world pushing still for ratification, civil society groups pushing for ratification around the world of the International Criminal Court statute. So there is an effort. I wish I could tell you that it was more robust, but the world is more interested, I think, typically in football, cricket, rugby, and basketball than they are in seeing international perpetrators of international crimes brought to justice.
I'm going to probably move towards bringing this to a conclusion, unless anybody desperately wants to intervene. I'm not sure whether Naina's with us, but I certainly want her to.
Yes, I am.
But before you,
I am.
But I want to ask one little question. Really, it arises from Nathan, I think, saying he was overwhelmed and how difficult was it all. And it's a question that I'm going to ask of Don in respect to something he told us, but you would find it would also be possible to ask of Hamid, of Arif, of Nick Vetch, and as well of Naina, because each of them in different ways has done things outside the straight line of their careers, which have had a consequence of maybe significance or of value. And in each case, when they look back on what they've done, Arif set up an NGO, and Naina set up this and has done many other things. Likewise, Nick and Hamid ran the Iran tribunal. When you look back, you think, how on earth did I manage ever to do that? And so I now come to you, Don. You said one day you decided to give up the life of commercial success and do something else. Now, it's quite interesting in light of Nathan's question and the questions we could have asked of these other contributors. Can you explain how you just make that first step and how once started, it's an irrevocable move? Can you explain that, if you can remember those years ago?
No, I can't, but I can give a clue. You know, I grew up in a household where I don't know how many times I heard, but I heard often the expression from my parents, don't leave a place the way you found it. Leave it the way you would like to have found it.
Thank you, Ben. Don, that's a great quotation. Naina.
I was telling you, this is an extreme form of humility, at least for me, when I listen and to Ben and to Don. And what is so important for some of us, we instinctively feel that whatever we do is not there for our status and for money, which is absolutely necessary in life. So do not think that I do not value these things. On the contrary, sometimes you can achieve more when you have institutions backing you, even your own foundation, you know. So, and but what is so necessary for me is, what is the point of me doing anything if it does not have effect on other people? You know, it is being a doctor, being a lawyer, being a street sweeper, being a gardener, astronaut, whatever profession you do, there is this service to the others, although you might not necessarily see it immediately. Not just your client if you're a lawyer, but you have to be aware of the changes you can make if you stick to if you maximize the points your profession gives to you. And this is why humility should not discourage you. You know, when Jeffrey and I took this megalomaniac endeavor, even thinking that for what we think and we believe in, that we would have an audience, it was insane. but we cultivate you as an audience, not for our purpose. But don't forget, sometimes immediate motivation should be your own ambition to move things, to change the places that Don so wonderfully explained to us. But, you know, humility was, why should anyone listen to us? And when you try to expand the borders and maximize your own stage of life, you cannot do it if you do not truly believe and respect for every human being, regardless of race, creed, education. So when we engage with you, we do not find or think that we have any reason to any superior position. Our age and experience advanced us at this point a little bit in front of you, not because we are smarter. I'm quite sure if we would do any sort of emotional cognitive test, that we would probably fare average within your group as well. But it does not discourage us to say what we want you to think, that you are empowered by the position that you are alive. I mean, imagine that we are alive. Think about all these people who left their lives in vain and cannot speak up for themselves. But we can, and how we are going to use our voice. And this is what motivates most of us who were in this very hard field. Don't have any illusions that once you are working for international tribunals that all people will be do-gooders. Not at all. They are as ambitious and as tough in any public company. But what you can take out of this is to understand that you represent voices of those who are not with us, and that we can make a difference, and for them and their survivors, just to taking care that our voices and what we learned is heard in the future. So I'll stop here because I really sound like an activist, which is not a bad thing to be. Thank you so much for your patience.
And thank you, Don, very much for contributing, as you say, as you heard said, the best to the last, at the last.
Oh, my thanks to all of you, really, for being here.